Last week we looked at how people are called by Christ. We looked at the story of the tax collector Levi, who was called by Jesus to come and follow, and saw how Levi just left behind his tax station, that day's taking and his paperwork, and followed Jesus. We looked at what was required to hear Jesus' call to us today, thought about how we today can hear Jesus speak to us with the same immediacy as Levi would have experienced his life-changing call. We thought about setting aside time in our day to listen to Jesus' word to us, through our reading or hearing of the scriptures, through our prayerful listening, and through our own sharing in fellowship. We heard from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who was placed in a concentration camp 75 years ago this year for his membership of the German resistance, that all that was required to follow Jesus was to get up and walk after him. We read Bonhoeffer's insight that rather than being easy, this getting up and walking with Jesus may well be a difficult process, because it requires for us to cut long-established ties, patterns of behavior, even to leave behind familiar surroundings. If Levi had not left the tax station, he would not have become a follower of Jesus. In the same way, we were encouraged to reflect on what we may need to leave behind in order to follow Jesus today. I wonder how you got on with your reflections on these questions last week. Did you hit obstacles during the week? What were they? Or did you feel that you needed more tools to help you reflect? How did you find the change from speaking to listening in your prayer time? And have you made time to take up the scriptures and listen to Jesus' words to you? How did you do in the translation of the intention to follow with the doing of following? Today we'll be looking some more at what is entailed in the doing aspects of following Jesus. Following Jesus means doing God's will, and God's will is made known to us when we listen and hear his word to us. At the heart of today's gospel reading stands the word doing. What must I do to inherit eternal life? The lawyer asks Jesus. And Jesus asks him about whether he's done what we did during the course of the last week. Have you read the scriptures? He asks. What do you read there? The lawyer had faithfully studied the scriptures and cited the first and great commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus assures the lawyer that it is this doing of God's will, loving God with all one's capacity and loving one's neighbor as oneself, that shapes life in God's presence here and life forever in God's presence hereafter. You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live, Jesus assures his questioner. Jesus tells the lawyer that it is in doing the things that God commands that he will inherit eternal life. When we do what God wishes us to do, we tap into the life that lasts. Because when we align our will with his will, if we set our hearts on what he loves, then we already share in the life that is forever. Conversely, if like the lawyer in today's story, we seek to qualify or find reasons why we may not be able to align our wills with God's, then we may lose out. Do not find the capacity to share in the life that God promises. When told the reassuring news that it is precisely as he himself had said, that it was by doing God's will that people found life, the lawyer questioned the interpretation of that will. All right, I understand that in order to live, I need to love God with all the gifts that God gives me and my neighbor as myself, but who is my neighbor? In another context, say that of someone who understands well that it is a good thing to love our neighbors and serve them through positive action, someone might instead ask, what does it mean to love myself? Or how can I love God? At the end of our gospel story, Jesus tells his questioner, go and do likewise. He reinforces the example of the one passerby who did what God commanded to do. And the gospel story moves on. We're not left, as in the story of the rich young man, with a reaction. Remember, the young man digested what Jesus told him to do in order to follow him, Go and sell your possessions and then come and follow me, determined that this command was too hard and went away grieving. Today, Jesus simply leaves the lawyer and moves on. God's call means doing God's will, the story tells us, and our questioning that will separates us from God. Whether that separation is brought actively, as in the story of the young man who walks away from Jesus grieving, or passively, as in the story of the lawyer from whom Jesus simply moves on. When God calls, there are three possible responses we may make. Firstly, the call is made and we obey and follow, as in the case of Levi and Peter and Andrew, James and John last week. Jesus called, the five left everything immediately to follow and share in that call. They made their immediate active response. They got up, left, and at once followed Jesus. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer observes, first obey, do the external works, let go of what binds you, give up what is separating you from God's will. Do not say, I do not have the faith for that. You will not have it, so long as you do not take that first step. And the five who were the first to be called into discipleship realized that right here in front of them is God's living word, God's own command made flesh, calling out to them to get up and follow. Bonhoeffer explains, here the gracious call of Jesus Christ to discipleship becomes a strict law. Do this, stop that, come out of the boat to Jesus, leave the toll booth and follow. And Levi and the four fishermen hear and obey and do what Jesus commands them to do. Follow me, he calls, and they simply get up and follow. They hear the word and do it without question, whether or not fully they understand what is asked of them. Faith will grow and follow that first doing, that first stepping out, Bonhoeffer tells. You believe, so take the first step. It leads to Jesus Christ. You do not believe, take the same step. It is commanded of you. The second response to God's call is like that of the rich young man. The call is made and we want to obey and follow, but the demands of the doing part of the call on us are too hard. In the story of the rich young man, he realizes that his heart is set more on his possessions than on God, and he walks away grieving. Bonhoeffer reflects, Jesus only has one expectation of me, namely that I believe. Believe that God's will for me is good, his command to me life-giving. Believe that life in his presence is greater and better than any other way of living. He explains, my faith, however, is not tied to poverty or wealth or some such thing. On the contrary, in faith I can be both, rich and poor. The rich young man's possessions claim his heart, command his thinking, determine his doing. In examining what it means to follow, the main concern, Bonhoeffer concludes, is not that I have any worldly goods, but that I should possess goods as if I did not possess them, and inwardly be free of them. What is important is not what I have or not, but what I do. By all means have possessions, but have them as you did not have them. Do not set your hearts on possessions, but do instead set your hearts on God. And the realization that setting our heart on God means changing will always be heart-wrenching. Just as in the case of the rich young man, it was heart-breaking, because his obedience was to his wealth, not God. Bonhoeffer tells, the young man is standing before Jesus, the Son of God. The full encounter is present. The only choices are yes or no, obedience or disobedience. And grieving disobedience is still disobedience, still is not following. The third response to God's call is the response shown in today's Gospel reading. There are choices to be made, and those choices are active choices, are about doing the acts of love, about doing God's will, our Gospel reading tells us. The call is made, the doing part, love God, love your neighbor as yourself, is reinforced, and yet the lawyer sees an ambiguity in the command, questions, who then is my neighbor? And, unable to accept the command, is left behind by Jesus. That is one of the slyest forms of disobedience to God's call, Bonhoeffer explains. What then happens is that people get so stubborn in their disobedience that they claim they can no longer discern between what is good and what is God's command. They claim it is ambiguous and permits various interpretations. and so the lawyer professes that he seeks to be obedient, but feels that God will not tell him how he can be so. Rather than seek God, the lawyer is in fact running away from God, Bonhoeffer tells. If the questioner is standing directly before God, then he is exposed as one who was fleeing from God's revealed commandment, which he himself already knew. Why does he act as if he did not already know the answer to his question? Why does he want to accuse God of leaving him in ignorance in this most decisive question of life? Bonhoeffer reflects on the lawyer's questions. The question, what should I do, is the first betrayal. The answer is, do the commandment that you know. You should not ask, you should act. The question, who is my neighbor, is the final question of despair or hubris, in which disobedience justifies itself. The answer is, you yourself are the neighbor. Go and be obedient in acts of love. And in this way, Bonhoeffer believes, the lawyer is already caught and brought to judgment. He's called back from the question of salvation in general to simple obedience. Responding to the call to follow Jesus, then, simply means doing what Jesus calls us to do. Responding to Jesus' call means following Jesus' commandments. And those commandments are given us as an opportunity to do in practical terms what Jesus models. When we do the actions of faith, when we obey Jesus' call, we shift from the abstract beliefs of the lawyer, who professed that he had followed all of God's commandments all his life, who clearly knew what was required of him, but failed to act on that knowledge, to the practical faith Jesus invites us to share through what we do. When we follow Christ's call as disciples, faith becomes a quality, an action, a vocation that we take on ourselves and actively live out, a practice and a discipline of actions that give shape to our faith. I give thanks that God gifts us the practice of the doing aspects of our faith. And so in the week to come, I invite you to do 3 things. Firstly, think about what being obedient to Jesus' call for you means. What does it mean for you to do the will of God? What does it feel like when you do God's will? Perhaps write down what practical obedience to God looks and feels like for you. Secondly, think about what stands in the way of your being obedient to Jesus' call. Are there things or concerns that you may need to let go of, like the rich young man, in order to be obedient? Or are there fundamental dispositions that need shifting in your lives, like the self-righteousness of the lawyer? How will you go about shifting, changing? Perhaps make a concrete plan, listing the kind of areas you commit to working on in your faith life. And finally, think about how you can show forth in your life the love that God has for you by loving yourself and your neighbors more. What does it feel like to be loved? What does it feel like to love yourself as you love God? How do you show that love to yourself? And how can you share that love with others? Again, I encourage you to think of concrete ways in which you can practice in this coming week. Write those things down and begin to put them into practice. When Jesus commands, then I should know that he never demands legalistic obedience, Bonhoeffer says. Indeed, he has only one expectation of me, namely that I believe. And that belief is expressed in concrete action. Do this and you shall live, Jesus said to the lawyer. And to both him and to us, he says, go and do likewise.